Welcome back to the Rum Ration, the podcast where we dive deep into the stories of those ordinary men and women who achieved the extraordinary in conflicts across the globe. I'm Colin, and with me, as always, is my historical fire team partner, Rejoy.
Always a pleasure, Colin. We're two former infantry officers turned amateur historians, and what we truly love, Colin, is uncovering the thread of camaraderie and selflessness that runs through the combat experience, whether it's 1944, 1389, or 216 BCE.
Which you can go back to a prior episode.
Yes.
Recorded on my birthday, all about a special battle. Exactly. Not Rome's happiest day, right?
No. A sad day indeed for the Romans, but a happy day for the Carthaginians.
That's right. And today in episode 24, we're doing something a little different. We're not talking about Carthaginians or Romans. We're paying tribute to an iconic weapon, a kind of complicated actor, if you will, an actor that was gregarious and popular among the senior officers and planners. It certainly looked the part. And
it certainly did.
It did, yes, absolutely. And it seemed to be all things to all people, but often failed to connect with or sometimes outright betrayed the common soldier.
Yes, we're talking about a tool, a weapon that became a symbol of desperation, necessity, and sheer frustrating unreliability.
Wait, are we talking about me here?
And we're not talking about Apple either. We are, of course, talking about the Sten submachine gun. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we'd like to announce that our very next episode will be our silver jubilee of sorts. Yay!
Hey!
Episode 25. We're going to devote it to talking about some of our favorite war movies. So we welcome any suggestions that you might have. So please feel free to, send in your suggestions of what we should talk about and some of your favorite war movies.
That's right. You can send an email to info@rumration.ca, or you can reach us on Instagram, or reach out to either Rejoy and I on any kind of social media platform that you can find us on. Yeah. And the name of this episode here is about the Sten gun. It's ugly, cheap, and deadly, which I think we've been described as being all of those.
Yeah, we have
certain
indeed. Yes. Yeah. Very fitting. Yeah.
Right. So the Sten has been compared, some would say, unfairly to the Rum Ration podcast in that way, right? I don't think that's necessarily the kindest thing in the world. It was ugly. It was cheaply made and universally distrusted by many of the fighting men who carried it.
I think it's spot on, isn't it?
I think foreshadowing, really. I think maybe we should change the Rum Ration logo to have a Sten gun on it. But all teasing aside, it was also absolutely vital to the Allied war effort. And let's trace the story of this strange, complex tool of infantry fire superiority. But first, this episode of Rum Ration is brought to you by one of our favorite new fantasy sponsors, Sten Gun Gin. Like its namesake, it's cheap, mass-produced, and sometimes a little unreliable. But when it works, nothing hits harder. Sten Gun Gin. Perfect for your next Sten and Tonic.
Nothing hits harder. That is absolutely spot on. So let's set the scene. It's 1940, and Britain is fighting for its life, facing the immediate threat of a German invasion. The continent has been lost. And with the evacuation from Dunkirk, the British Army had abandoned or lost thousands of critical small arms.
Yeah, a major problem was firepower. The standard infantry weapon, the Lee Enfield rifle, was magnificent at range, but couldn't deliver the close quarter volume of fire needed. Britain was scrambling to buy every Thompson submachine gun available from the United States. And the Thompson itself had been designed as a trench broom, that was what it was referred to as a time, for World War I, and was made famous by U.S. gangsters like Al Capone. Heck, even Churchill posed for an absolute legend of a badass photo with a Thompson. He's got the cigar hanging out of his mouth, he's got the Thompson on his hip. He looks pretty badass. So take a look on Google. You got to check that one out.
So the problem was the procurement, which was unsustainable.
Yeah.
Like all supply chain management down to the present day. The Thompsons were beautifully made, certainly, but they were exceptionally expensive. In 1939, a Thompson cost $200, dropping slightly to $70 in 1942. Compare that to what the Sten would eventually cost, and we'll get there. But supply was also hampered as many ships carrying these weapons across the Atlantic were sunk by the German U-boats because, of course, at this time, the Battle of the Atlantic was raging, wasn't it? And you've got a lot of your arms shipments heading to the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, and we touched on the intricacies of licensing gun manufacturing as well in our Ross rifle episode. So perhaps the Americans weren't ready to share the license for the construction or the manufacturing of the Thompson. Who knows? Yeah. So. But the British had attempted another domestic design, the Lanchester, which was a copy of the captured German MP-28. But the Lanchester was built to pre-war standards using high-quality materials and craftsmanship. We don't want any of that shit. No. It was too labor-intensive and it was far too complicated to produce in the immense numbers that were needed. We needed lots of weapons fast.
6 months for one weapon is unacceptable. No matter how beautifully done, with the
A
etchings on the
bespoke weapon.
side. That's right. Oh, when you said you wanted a hunting rifle, I didn't know you meant you were hunting Germans. So Britain was literally running out of cash, and they needed cheap indigenous submachine guns immediately. None of this high quality nonsense. Necessity is being the mother of invention, and that led to the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield being commissioned to create an alternative.
That's right. This desperate demand for a cheap, simple weapon is the origin story of our complicated weapon that we're going to talk about here today. And the solution came from two key designers, Major Reginald V. Shepard, who was an inspector of armaments, and Harold J. Turpin, who was a senior draftsman.
And of course, the name itself is an acronym. I mean, if you're wondering, why would you name a gun a Sten gun? It's an acronym because it's not a misspelling of stun. It's actually Sten. And it's often attributed to the Director General of Artillery, taking the S from Shepard, the T from Turpin, and EN for Enfield, the location of the factory. Makes a lot of sense. Now, before we go much further, I'd like to mention that rum ration is fueled by Sten gun gin, the spirit of the underground, smuggled across borders, easy to hide, and guaranteed to kick like a 9mm. Sten gun gin, raise a glass and resist ordinary drinks, or even good ones.
Nobody wants anything ordinary. That's right. Thank you for that explanation. And of course, a shameless plug of a sponsor who doesn't actually exist. If anyone wants to sponsor us, we're open to it. We work for cheap.
As we keep mentioning. Yes, we work for cheap. We'll throw that in. Works with this episode.
We're just like the Sten. Of course, the result of Shepard, Turpin, and Enfield was the absolute antithesis of the Thompson. The Sten was austere, it was stripped down, and fundamentally, like us, it was cheaply made.
The catalyst here isn't just the invention, though, but the moment this weapon was thrust into the hands of the common soldier, and they immediately saw its true primitive nature. So I think that's where this kind of kicks in.
Yeah.
So guess what? They had a name for it. The plumber's nightmare.
Naturally. The Sten's design philosophy was radical for the time. It utilized simple stamped metal components and very minor welding. None of that fine machining that went into such prized accurate rifles like the Ross rifle. See episode number 16, titled A Cautionary Tale for Defense Procurement. Yeah, no, none of that good fine quality marksmanship or workmanship here. No, much of the Sten's production could be handled by small workshops. And on the Mark II, the most common variant, only the barrel and the bolt were machined parts. Everything else was stamped.
Well, there you go. Dubious production work there, just like our podcast.
That's right. So, cheap and effective.
Cheap and effective. There you are. This simplicity translated directly into the legendary low cost. It took roughly 5 man-hours of work to produce a Mark III Sten. We heard earlier the Thompson cost mixing it up with the Sten now. We heard earlier the Thompson cost $70. Now, guess how much a Sten cost?
Well, the Thompson, didn't you say it cost $200 at the start of the war, and mass production got it down to 70? Yeah,
that's right, which is a massive reduction, but still, a Sten cost roughly $11.
Wow,
$11 compared to 70. Now, that's a staggering 536% difference, justifying the planner's high opinion of the weapon. I mean, who wouldn't? Look at the cost difference right there. How many can you churn out for $11?
Yeah, if you're in procurement, you think this is awesome.
Yeah.
But maybe not the fighting soldiers, because this is where the disconnect with the infantry begins. Despite the good intentions, and the Sten was mainly issued to infantry platoon sergeants, section commanders, officers, vehicle and weapon crews, and dispatch riders, and others who needed a short-barreled weapon. But almost immediately, the low-cost and minimalist look earned it deeply insulting nicknames from the troops right from the beginning.
Yeah, and they're pretty cruel. Woolworth Special, Plumber's Delight, even the stench gun. These are just a few of the insults that were hurled at this perfectly cheap weapon. It looked, frankly, like it was assembled from hardware store scraps. Some essential parts of early Stens, like springs, were actually sourced from hardware manufacturers, not gunsmiths.
Hence the Woolworth Special.
There you are.
Now, I know that you are married to an award-winning poet, but can
Indeed.
she measure up to some of the magnificent prose of the era? In a poem titled, quote, Ode to a Sten Gun, end quote, by a Canadian gunner, S.N. Teed, the soldier criticizes the weapon's appearance directly. Quote, you wicked piece of vicious tin. Call you a gun? Don't make me grin.
He does go on to mention, you're just a bloated piece of pipe. You couldn't hit a hunk of tripe.
Yeah, the Canadian versions The Canadian versions, and there was a Canadian version, was made at the Long Branch Arsenal, just outside of Toronto, now near, I guess, Oakville. And it was often said that it had better production quality with smoother edges and better tolerances. Of course, we'd say that. But the smoother edges and better tolerances is actually kind of important, as we will see later on. Yeah, it was considered better quality than the quickly welded together British guns, which were sometimes just kind of piled up after assembly. And the Sten gun has a distinction of being the first submachine gun manufactured in Canada. And by the end of 1944, there were about 100,000 of them that had been produced by the Small Arms Limited, which was a Crown corporation established in 1940, as I said, outside of the Toronto suburb of Long Branch, which would today be known as Etobicoke, not Oakville. I apologize.
No, Etobicoke.
Etobicoke. Not Etobicoke, which I thought it was when I first started dating my wife, who was from Toronto. I was corrected.
Well, that all depends on the nightclub scene.
That's right.
Sorry. We might get pulled for that. Anyway, its debut in Canadian service was in 1942 during the fateful Dieppe raid, which is worth an episode on its own. I'm sure we'll get to that at some point. John S. Edmondson, serving with the South Saskatchewan Regiment, recalled receiving the new guns right out of the shipping crates as they waited on the transport ships. Normally, when you get it right out of the crate,
Wouldn't
some
mind
there's that
testing it.
it's great to have it, this brand new piece of kit, but then maybe you want to test it before.
I'd kind of want to test it, but because they were already on board, they couldn't test fire them to check functionality. And likely, from what I've been researching, they didn't properly remove all the packing grease. Yeah,
that's not good.
And
That's
this
not so good.
oversight created a crisis, probably because excess packing grease would attract dust and dirt and then help jam it even more. So we have a quote from Edmondson about his terrifying first encounter. Quote, rounding the corner of a building, came face to face with a German and had my first experience using a Sten gun, he wrote. I pulled the trigger, a dull thud, misfire. He must have been more surprised and nervous than I was because he did not shoot. I ducked back around the corner and tried my Sten gun again, thud again. So I threw it away and picked up a rifle that someone had dropped on the ground. End quote.
And the German soldier probably just shit himself laughing.
Excuse
First,
me.
it looks like
I have a wiping incident.
A ridiculous piece of kit to begin with, and it doesn't even fire. But that encapsulates the immediate, profound distrust the men felt for this crude yet essential new tool of war. Edmondson was lucky to live long enough to be able to write about it. I mean, those first impressions, of course, are one thing, but the Sten went on to really play a pivotal role in the war, didn't it?
Well, yes, it did. I mean, mess has a certain quality all of its own, right?
It does.
There's a lot of them. The complication of the Sten gun is it's really because of its terrifying unreliability and poor safety record, like really poor safety record, which we'll get into. It embodied the failures of a weapon that looked good on the balance sheet, but left the troops vulnerable in the field. The
core functional issue was the magazine system. The magazine, which derived from the German MP28 magazine, which you had mentioned earlier, was a double column single feed design, meaning cartridges had to merge into a single column at the top. Now, I can see a bit of a complication happening there.
But you've dealt with that before.
Dirt, foreign matter, or rough handling could easily deform the magazine lips, causing frustrating misfeeds and jams. We experienced the joys of double feeds engaged on ourselves, didn't we, with the double column, single feed design magazines. Of course, we used blank rounds a lot of times, but
blank rounds, which are a little bit too small, not machined properly, and those fucking plastic mags. Remember those fucking plastic mags?
That's right.
Fuck, those were terrible. Fuck, I hated those things. Yeah. But we...
Yes. We remember your, what was it like one of those episodes we had, Tantrums?
Oh, come on now. Sleep deprived. I see. Not only am I tall and pudgy and pear-shaped like General Curry, I also suffer from sleep-deprived tantrums like he did. Yeah, go back to episode 23, I believe, to hear that one, folks. Yeah. Yes. So we read about veterans complaining about the Sten across multiple conflicts. Korean War veteran Charles Reese praised the Bren gun and the M1 carbine, but regarding the Sten, he explained, quote, the spring in the magazine was no darn good and used to jam up the rounds. So the boys did not want to take a chance and take one of them going out on any patrols.
Yeah, I can well imagine that. Are you going on a patrol? You want a weapon that'll actually function and not misfire. There was a dark running joke among the troops about whether the gun would actually work. One soldier noted that jamming didn't even require dirt. Dirt? Hell. There doesn't have to be any dirt, for right after you've cleaned and oiled it, the bastard takes the notion. You never know.
Fills you with confidence, eh?
Another story describes the uproarious laughter of men in a cellar, with one telling a story about when, quote, when a Sten gun actually fires when the trigger is pulled. Quite the punchline. In other words, it comes as such a surprise to everyone. The damn thing actually fired.
Yeah, he's telling the story about this, and the big punchline was, no, it actually fired.
It fired.
But that stemmed from what I'm about to talk about right now, because far worse oftentimes than the jamming was the accidental discharge issue, which means the weapon would just fire by itself without a finger on the trigger, which is unsettling to say the least. If particularly you're on the receiving end.
Good way to put it.
Yeah, unsettling. I think unsettling would be accurate way to say it. Because it was an open bolt weapon with a rudimentary safety device, dropping or jarring, meaning banging against it, a cocked Sten could cause the bolt to move forward enough to chamber and fire a round. Now,
Fabulous.
Luckily, I'm sure in combat, there's never any situation where you might drop it or, jar it.
Hopefully not.
So George Blackburn, a Canadian gunner who coincidentally was the longest serving forward observation officer in the Canadian Army in World War II. He went all the way from June 6th on D-Day all the way to VE Day as a foo. So he saw some shit. Wow. And he was my favorite author of the summer. I read his trilogy. And when he wrote in Guns of Victory, he recalls this event where a loaded Sten gun with the bolt cocked was, quote, accidentally dropped on his butt end, which caused it to fire off its entire magazine of bullets pinwheel fashion. Now, a lot of people don't know what a pinwheel is, but why don't you tell them what it is?
Well, the weapon was described as revolving slowly in the air while spitting bullets. Of course, you have to imagine that. As the barrel swiveled, leading everyone in the room to leap into the air to avoid the fire.
As it emptied, because apparently not only did it just go off when you dropped the thing, it would empty the entire fucking mag. So all 30 rounds are coming out. That's exciting.
Fully automatic.
You imagine being in a room and someone drops it and the thing is spiraling in the air like a pinwheel firing weapons. Holy shit. But apparently no one was actually hurt in that incident, believe it or not. Okay, so that wasn't a foible. That's a hazard. And the official response to these concerns, which caused many injuries in training and combat, was chillingly that the weapon was a, quote, throwaway, end quote, due to its low cost. And the accidental discharges were, of course, due to user error.
Yes.
That would be the official response.
We have the first documented use of that term, user error, which is now come down to why is my phone not turning on? User error. The ultimate heartbreaking example, though, of the Sten's propensity for failure is Operation Anthropoid in Prague, May 1942. Czechoslovak agents Josef Gabček and Jan Kubis were tasked by the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, which is the precursor of the MI6, essentially, to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich, the principal architect of the Holocaust, often called the Butcher of Prague.
Yeah. They waited until Heydrich's open-top Mercedes slowed for a tight curve as he was driving along. And then Gabček raised his Sten machine gun to fire point blank, but as the sources confirm, the gun jammed.
Surprise.
Yeah. So, good Lord, can you imagine that? You're setting up an ambush and nothing. And then so Kubich had to hastily throw a modified anti-tank grenade instead, which mortally wounded Heydrich.
Yeah. Gabček's Sten's failure nearly doomed the mission, though, and tragically set off unimaginable consequences for the Czech people. Despite these terrible complications, the Sten survived. The change came not from perfecting the weapon, though improvements were made, but from the troops and resistance fighters who adapted to its flaws, which is really the clever thing to do in that case. Let's work around the problems. Troops learn how to deal with this complicated piece of hardware at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note, you mentioned resistant fighters there. One of the other things that they could do is they're building such huge quantities of these things, or manufacturing massive quantities of them, and they were so small, they could pack them up in huge bundles and just dump them into, drop them out of airplanes behind the lines for resistance, so French resistance, or here we have the Czech resistance fighters taking it. Officially, modifications were introduced, such as a Mark IV's cocking handle being designed to lock the bolt in the closed position. What a fucking great idea. To reduce. I notice I underlined reduce accidental discharge. I like that. Reduce. We're not going to stop accidental discharge. Yeah. By 1944, a formal modification required replacing the cocking handles with a Mark V style and drilling a new hole to secure the bolt as yet another additional safety precaution.
Additional. Well, there's the key word. Yes, additional. But functionally, the Sten was accepted because for all its faults, it did certain jobs superbly. It was chambered for the 9 times 19 millimeter parabellum round, meaning users could often raid German stocks for ammunition. And that's a big thing, you know?
That is. It's clever, right? It's almost self-serve. You drop it off behind, push a bunch out of the back of an airplane over enemy lines, and the local partisans pick it up and they go steal as much ammunition as they can from the Germans,
Exactly.
and it works. Yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah, and so it was terrible at long range. I mean, it wasn't designed for that. It was effective range was only about 60 meters compared to the 500 meters for the Lee Enfield rifle, but it provided devastating close quarters firepower, and it was very helpful for room clearing as the Allies pushed into Germany and Burma.
Yeah, that's right. Alan Lee of the Parachute Regiment confirmed this. The Sten came into its own for close quarter battle. Quote, he said, quote, when you went into a village or went into a house, whatever it was an ideal weapon, unquote. And then he clarified his statement. He said it wasn't a reliable instrument for anything over 100 yards, but for anything close quarters, it was very reliable. And I suppose when you're in close quarters battle, I mean, even if it jams, you can use it to clock guy over the head, or if it goes off accidentally, just throw it at them.
That's right.
The pinwheel will take care of the whole section there.
Well, okay, it's funny you say that. Apparently, now I can't find any actual citations, but there are lots of rumors of soldiers doing exactly that. Like instead of throwing a grenade into a room, they would actually cock a Sten and then throw the Sten through the window, and it would hit the ground and bounce and start firing off all over the place to take care of the Germans in there. So I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a great story. And we here at the Rum Ration, as a policy, try not to let facts get in the way of a good story.
No, they just muddy up the story.
We do, yeah. But as we mentioned, because it could be easily broken down, concealed, and reassembled, it was indispensable for airborne, glider-borne forces, and especially the resistance groups across occupied Europe. The British SOE provided thousands to partisans, and hence that cleverness about being able to use the captured German 9mm ammunition.
Yeah, these resistance fighters, really, they made the Sten their own, didn't they?
Yeah, they did.
They became masters of the Sten. They learned how to repair and modify them, and many groups, including those in Poland and Norway, started scratch building their own illegal Sten clones in small workshops.
That's pretty clever.
Don't worry about licensing.
No, I don't think they worried about licensing on this one because no one paid for it. The ultimate nod of respect, though, came from the enemy, because late in the war, Germany, who were desperate for cheap arms for the Volkssturm, began producing copies. They first made you should pronounce that, not me.
Yeah, the Great Potsdam.
Okay, yeah, exactly what he
so
said.
Great means basically tool.
Well, that's what you've been calling me all this time. I thought that was a term of endearment.
Term of endearment.
Son of a.
It is here. It is definitely here. Great Potsdam.
But it was an exact copy of the Mark II. They probably weren't paying licensing fees or royalties to the British, I guess. But then the Germans simplified it. The Germans simplified it even further into the MP 3008, the Maschinenpistole 3008. Was that correct? Kind of. How would you say that?
3008. Maschinenpistole, yeah.
Okay, all right. Which was essentially a cheaper Sten with a vertical magazine, so I guess helped the rounds just kind of fall in. Use gravity to your advantage, like a Bren gun. And the Sten was such an effective concept for mass production that Germany literally had to copy it. Kind of hilarious when they ended up copying the most dangerous variant, not the one with the enhanced safety catch. I guess by late 44, they weren't really caring.
Safety wasn't a big issue in those.
No.
Let's throw the damn thing at the enemy. So the Sten story ends with this legacy. This cheap weapon, born of desperation, became one of the most produced submachine guns of the Second World War, with anywhere from 3.7 to 4.6 million units made. I mean, just think about that, eh?
That's huge.
4.6 million units. Incredible.
That's, more than one for every member of the British Army.
Yeah.
But the human consequences of its initial unreliability were severe, and not just for the soldiers, but for example, after Gabček's Sten failed to fire in that assassination, Heydrich was mortally wounded by that grenade, and he died on June 4th, 1942, and Hitler ordered immediate reprisals.
Yeah. The Nazis destroyed the villages of Lidice and Litsaki in the Czech Republic. All 199 men in Lidice were killed, and the women and children were executed or imprisoned. Overall, an estimated 5,000 people were murdered in the reprisals, confirming the resistance leaders' earlier fears that the consequences would be immeasurable.
Yeah, and I realize now, after I wrote that, it's probably unfair to lay that at the feet of the Sten, because
I was just
the Sten didn't actually kill him, didn't kill Heydrich. It was the grenade. So.
And his execution by the partisans.
That was the design. The end goal was achieved. He was killed.
Exactly.
Yeah. But, the cost, however, according to some, achieved its strategic goals. The Czechoslovak president in exile, do you know how to pronounce that?
I think it's Beneš.
Beneš. He felt the dramatic action was necessary to show the world that Czechs were allies, and subsequently Britain declared the Munich Agreement destroyed, and the operation was the only verified government-sponsored assassination of a senior Nazi leader during the war. The sacrifices made by the agents and the civilians who sheltered them, even facing down the unreliable Sten, achieved the extraordinary.
Yeah. But then the concession, the acknowledgement that in the absolute worst moments, this ugly thing was essential. George Blackburn wrote, quote, "How many hundreds or even thousands of Canadian and British soldiers have died because their Stens failed to fire when they were face to face with the enemy?"
Yeah. And our earlier poet, Connor Teed, ended his prose with referring to the Sten, quote, "But when you're with me in the night, I'll tell you, pal, you're just all right," end quote. Which makes me want to point out that tonight's episode is powered by our another fantasy sponsor, Sten Gun Gin. Why spend a fortune on fancy spirits when you can get the firepower for under $10? Mix up a Sten and tonic, cheap, cheerful, and surprisingly effective. Sten Gun Gin, official sponsor of the Rum Ration Podcast, because like the Rum Ration Podcast, it's ugly, but it works.
And cheap. Let's not forget cheap. So in conclusion, the Sten remained in service long after the war, including with Canadian troops in the Korean War, although it was still not well liked, to put it mildly, and often replaced by American weapons. It was used by the Royal Navy well into the 1960s.
Jesus Christ. It just dawned on me, the Royal Navy on all steel ships, and this thing had a tendency of going off if it was dropped or banged. We don't want to drop it on like dropping it on an earth floor. Okay, maybe it's a little soft, but on a metal deck, like, oof. Yeah.
No.
It was a messy, fought, and lethal weapon. It failed often, but when it worked, bought its users the time and fire superiority needed to survive. The Sten gun is truly a tribute to the ingenuity of necessity and the resilience of the combatants who wrestled it into effectiveness. That wraps up our look at a complicated weapon that was a Sten gun. What a balance to strike. A weapon so hated, yet still so essential.
Indeed. Actually, I'm wondering, when we were young officers, I think the Canadian Army still used the Sterling.
The SMG, yeah.
The SMG, which looked surprisingly similar to the Sten. I wonder if that was an evolution of the Sten. If anybody knows.
I believe it was, but the big difference was it was all machined, as it wasn't stamped parts. It was machined parts.
I see.
Much higher quality. Because the biggest problem with the jamming and all that stuff, because it was machined and rushed out, so you had little bits of metal that were still sticking out, little burrs, and it wasn't perfectly fit, so things wouldn't, the magazine wouldn't fit properly, so sometimes the rounds would come out, or the safety.
The safety.
As it was, would just kind of slip right out, like, yay.
Yeah, the Sterling definitely had its safety, thank goodness. So this reminds us that often the most effective tools in warfare are those that simply get the job done. Regardless of how ugly they look or how frustrated the people feel using them, sometimes true courage is fighting with equipment you don't trust. Mm-hmm. As Donald Rumsfeld once famously said, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you might want or wish to have at a later time.
Yeah, he got a lot of grief for that, but he was accurate.
He was right. He was right. Yeah.
All right. So before we wrap up, we want to thank all of you for listening to the Rum Ration Podcast, and join us for next time for our 25th episode, our Jubilee episode, as it were. I think we should have should throw ourselves a parade.
We should.
Maybe
we're too cheap for that.
Yeah, true. We could issue ourselves a medal, like our Jubilee medal, but we're too cheap for that too. We'll get one printed on the T-shirt.
We'll get one printed on the shirt.
Instead of the king's effigy, we'll have a rum bottle on it. There you go. But at our Jubilee episode, it's going to be a lot of fun. Rejoy suggested we're going to be discussing our favorite war movies. So send us your suggestions, either info@rumration.ca, or go on our website, rumration.ca, go on Instagram, find us on social media. We'd love to hear from you and hear your suggestions.
Yeah, we'll throw some of them out there as well. Happy to do so. So until then, keep your powder dry and keep those magazines clean.
Cheers to history.
History.